This is my 5th time speaking at Open Source India, actually going back to Linux in Asia in 2006. So I'm a veteran of this, but anyway, I'm on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University in Silicon Valley. I run an open source research program which deals with evaluation, adoption, and use of open source. Before I went back to university, I did startups for 20 years. We were one of the first companies to put open source software in a commercial product. Sun Microsystems was first, we were second. We were one of the first 100 .coms, so you can go find IDE.com on number 78 to get a .com. So I've been doing this a while. And so I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different organizations, companies, and governments in a lot of different places around the world. What I want to talk about today are the issues around organizational adoption and use and where people are now. How many of you heard the Comcast talk in Hall 1 just before? Great. So, we're going to say many of the same things in a different way, but I thought it was really a well-done talk. So when I was here the first time, well, actually it was in Delhi, open source wasn't very widely used by organizations. In fact, it wasn't very widely used at all, except by those of us who really didn't like paying money for software. The world has changed, and now, of course, open source has become mainstream, right? So when you ask how many people are using open source, it's almost everyone. And if somebody tells you they're not, they're wrong. Because every cloud-based service that is out there has open source software in it somewhere, even the software that's used by companies that we think of as being highly proprietary. So, just more proof of it being everywhere. Android has an 82% market share, and Android, we can say it's open. I mean, there are little pieces that aren't, and the handset manufacturers add their own little pieces to it here and there. But those are really numbers. Another thing that's really amazing is that when somebody did a survey of all the servers last year, 37% of them run Linux. And a few of them still run Sun OS or Solaris rather, and some run other things. All of the world's supercomputers run on Linux. That's really quite an amazing result, and when you consider how things have come along. If you go to GitHub, there are so many projects there that it's hard to find them. When there are 100 million projects, 1% of them is a million. Are there a million high-quality open source projects out there? No, there aren't. How about 1/10 of a percent? Are there 100,000 good projects out there? No, there aren't. How about 100th of a percent? Now we're getting somewhere, 10,000. That's a good estimate. And even that might be a bit generous. But so it's a problem that people have, is finding high-quality open source software. And I spent some time on a project called OSS PAL that tries to find good projects and help people discover them. So there are a lot of reasons why open source has become popular, right? It offers a lot of advantages to people, not just that it's free. The fact that there are foundations that are around that support this software. We all know about the Document Foundation and Mozilla and Apache and Eclipse and Linux and on and on and on. There are quite a number of open source foundations. They have their own licenses that they use for software in some cases, and they kind of keep the projects under control, make sure that they're active and maintained and responsive. They're very proud of the fact that they are working on projects and making them available to other people. There have been a lot of studies done about the cost of open source. And the question always comes up, is it less expensive? And the answer is yes. And the reason it's less expensive is that you don't pay the upfront license fee. You may pay just as much for support and training with open source projects as you would for the commercial ones, but the fact that you're not paying all that money up front lowers the total cost of ownership and lowers the risk, because if you decide you don't like it, you haven't spent that $100,000 or whatever it is, and you can give up on it without so much cost. Another thing that's really important is that you get community involvement in these development. When you put those projects out there, you know, not every smart person works for the same company. Okay. So when you want to get a collection of people who are able to contribute to your project, making it open source is a good way to do it. Because I might come along someday and say, well, I'm really interested in contributing to a project that addresses climate change. That's, you know, some cause that I believe in, and I want something that's going to maybe save the southeastern corner of the United States. Well, I can go find a project like that, no doubt, right? And so, you know, this is how some projects are able to sustain themselves and find new people, because successful projects have new blood, right? You have to keep bringing new people in to make contributions. One of the other things that happened that was really important over the past 10 or 12 years is this notion of software technology innovation. If you go back to the earlier days of the open source communities, and this is a point that others have made too, what you see is that those early efforts tried to replicate things that were being done in the proprietary world, but making them open source. Right? So Linux is a great example of that. But so is OpenOffice. And there are many others that were really just saying, look, we'll build something that does the same as that proprietary software. Even today, there's something called it was called originally OpenProj, and now it's called Project Libre. And it's basically a Microsoft project equivalent. Right? It can read MPP files and do all the things that you would want it to do. So that was then. But now, when we look at the advances that have been going on in open source, you know, it's managing large volumes of data, right? So the NoSQL databases, it's IoT platforms, it's a bunch of things like that, right, that have come along, and they don't come out as proprietary first, they come out as open source first, because they want to get people to contribute, and so when you look for innovation in software these days, you don't look necessarily to the proprietary companies. You can find a lot of the interesting innovation in the open source community. And if you're wanting to contribute to a project, you know, you'd much rather contribute to something where you can make that contribution and it will be valuable, and you're not increasing the proceedings of some company in Germany. So that's one of the things that gets people interested in participating. Now, here you are, you're running a business, or you're a senior executive in a business, and here's this open source stuff coming out around you. What do you get from it? What are the implications? Well, first, of course, here's all this high-quality software that's being put out there for you to use. If you want to contribute back, that would be great. But in the early days of adoption by enterprises, they don't tend to make a lot of contributions. That comes over time. But companies are recognizing that they need to bring open source culture into their businesses, one way or another. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One of them is that it's a valuable recruiting tool. And it works both ways. It's both that the company can say to prospective employees, oh yes, you can continue to work on your open source project, or we do open source and you can publish and you can contribute and your results will be visible. It's also important for you as a prospective employee because a lot of companies now ask their applicants, tell me where your GitHub page is. They want to go look at the code that you've written. They want to go look at the documentation you've written. And if you've been a contributor, they can see how good you are. And it's really a good way to get a job. You know, I have a bunch of students, and some of them do this and have been successful. However, you know, we talk about this organizational adoption, and you might think that, okay, that just happens. Well, it doesn't. And it doesn't happen because change is hard. Right? People don't change easily. Right? I was making a joke about it the other day. Coca-Cola, okay? Do I drink Pepsi? Never. Okay? And that's a very simple example, but change is hard. People get familiar with what they're doing, and they stick with it. So why is that in enterprises? First of all, many of them have made a huge investment in existing software and systems. If you're running your business on SAP or on Oracle, you know, are you going to get rid of that? No. You're not going to get rid of it because everybody knows how to use it. Your business runs on it. If you switch to something else, it might break. The risk is high. So it would be very, very hard to go in there as a vendor of an ERP system and say, well, you should get rid of SAP and use ours. Not going to happen in a large company. The place that the open source success happens is early in the life of a smaller company, which then grows to be successful. Change is also psychological. Not everyone is an early adopter. A lot of people want to sit there and see what happens, right? Were you the first one on your street to buy a smartphone? Maybe. Okay. But there are a lot of people who are still kind of edging into it. There's a period of time over which adoption gets made. The last thing is, as I said before, change can be risky. Right? And if you're a chief information officer or a chief executive officer in a company, you don't like any more risk than you need. I mean, being in business is enough risk in itself. And as we see, companies go up and down in their level of success. Some of the companies that we thought would never, ever have problems are in deep trouble. And other companies come from nowhere and capture market share. There's a saying that I've used for years, which I would say is, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. I didn't make that line up, and in fact, I've changed the grammar a bit. But that's the attitude in a lot of companies. This is working just fine. Why should we change it? Well, it gets companies into trouble sometimes because there's all this change going on, and they're not aware of it or not addressing it, and then, you know, not too long from now, they discover that they are broken. So when we think about enterprises and their adoption of open source software, there are questions that you hear all the time because, you know, it's new, right? Change. How do we deal with these things? What are the issues that they need to deal with? First of all, when they use proprietary software, they're very comfortable with calling up the support. They pay for support, they pay for services, for training, all these kinds of things. They know who to call. If it's a community open source project, they have to go to the forum, they have to post their question, or they have to post their bug, and they have to wait for a response. The response might be faster than they would get from, you know, contacting their commercial vendor, but it's a different process. So access to support and services, especially for business critical software, right? if you're using some kind of e-commerce system and it breaks or the server goes down or whatever it is, and you're not able to sell your product online while it's down, that's significant. So those are the kinds of things that that worry people. Another thing that companies worry about is working in public. Okay. So I'm going to do open source. I could do it internally, right, and not tell anybody about it. But if we're really going to do open source, we're going to do it in public. We're going to create a repository. We're going to let people come and contribute to the project. And all these developers aren't quite used to that change, the idea that everybody in the world can look at their code. Right? That's very different from sharing it with your very small team of people. And some people are uncomfortable with it. They need to get adjusted to that whole way of working. Another thing that comes up that's a concern for companies are these licenses. Right? Now, they will sit there and they will open up the Apple Music Store, and up will come a click to approve the license. They haven't read it, and it's 30 pages long. Okay, written for people with degrees in law. No, they're happy with that because they know how that all works. But then along comes, an Apache license, which isn't very complicated by comparison, and they don't know what this all means. It's a different way of doing things. So dealing with licenses and what does it mean to redistribute, what do the freedoms give you and what do they not give you. Another thing that comes up as a concern happens when one company wants to merge or take over another company. Right? Here's all this source code that the other company has. How do I know that it really is not proprietary code? How do I know that people actually wrote it? We heard this morning about a mention about companies like Synopsys, which owns Black Duck now, and others that will do this code checking for you. But again, it's a different way of doing business. It's different from what went on before. So organizations worry about this, of course. And the last thing is that there's a distinction in most companies between what's generic infrastructure, the operating system, the database system. That stuff isn't interesting. What's interesting is the value added that that company creates. So they're happy to give away or to use open source software for database management or for their operating system or for their networking tools, some of those kinds of things. But they have to say, this is the stuff, some piece of it, that's our intellectual property. And they worry about protecting that in a world where things are open source. So how are they going to make that distinction? That's a thing that comes up very, very often. All right, so now we've seen that companies are adopting open source, but they need to manage that adoption in an intelligent way, one that provides value for their company and protects them against the kinds of concerns that we just talked about. So this is a really central thing, which is establishing enterprise policies for the use of free and open source software. So to look at these important open source issues, once again, first thing is, here's my company. Who's using open source software? Which packages are they using? Which versions of which package are they using? Which platform are they using it on? Did they apply the latest update that fixed some security patch? Is that software being used internally, or is it being used in a product that is being hosted, or is it being used in a product that's being delivered to customers? All of those things are different and have to be handled differently because the licenses say different things about those things. So I might be running a little project and I'm using MySQL 5.710. That's what the speaker was talking about earlier. And now, do I want to change to MySQL 8.0? The salesperson says, oh, yes, absolutely, you must, you should. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, the reason is very simple. It works with 5.7.10. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? So this is, an important issue. And so, somebody has to try to keep track of that, comply with the licenses, to make sure you understand where open source code is being used in products that are being distributed to customers or used by customers. And two more things. One is to come up with policies for employees to participate in open source projects and make sure they understand how to use open source internally in their projects and when they're going to include it in projects to make sure that everybody knows. So these are the functions that have to be addressed, and the speaker earlier talked about an open source project office, and that's exactly the right thing. That's what companies are starting to do, and making sure that there's some central organization or central individual, depending on how big your company is, that tries to keep track of these things and also helps train people, new employees, about what are our policies around open source, how do we do these kinds of things and make them work. So the way that this happens in most companies is that they start by creating a policy. Companies have policies, right? They have policies about how many days of vacation you can take. They have policies about almost everything that you can imagine. So here's a new policy. You work for us, here's how we deal with open source software. Now that policy is written with a lot of audiences in mind. First, it's written for the employee who's going to be using it, but it's also being written for the legal staff that gets to review these licenses. It's written for the company executives who have to decide, are we going to invest in open source, which projects, how are we going to move forward? And it's also written for human resources, the organization in the company that's responsible for hiring people and dismissing them, as the case may be, because human resources can take advantage of a company's participation in open source as a recruiting tool, as we said earlier. So the idea of policy has a lot of audiences. And what happens is that over time, as you get more experience with open source, you discover that the best way to handle this in most cases is to create this open source project office. So the speaker from Comcast spoke specifically about that, and I'll come back to his case in a moment. But basically, what does the open source project do? It is the home of all of these policies. Right? So whoever is the director of that open source project office makes sure that the policies are established, communicated to everybody, updated frequently, projects get reviewed. You look at a proposal to use open source software, and you might ask, is this something, do we have the ability, what license is it under? Can we use it in a product, or can we only use it internally? Should this be a project that we're going to be contributing to? Again, that may not happen initially, but all the issues that go around using the product internally and keeping track. So when you have something that comes up, like the Heartbleed example in SSL that we were talking about earlier today, the Open Source Project Office knows every project in the company that's using it. And when that problem arises, a zero-day problem, they know exactly who to contact, they know which pieces of code are affected. So even if people on other projects aren't paying attention, you find and fix that key problem. Other thing that happens is that different groups are using the same software. They don't know it. One of the things that you discover if you ever go visit a company with a lot of different divisions is they tend not to talk to each other. When you come in as the outsider, then they'll talk to you, and you'll say to them, "Oh, did you know these guys over here were doing that?" And their answer is no. Well, you guys should meet. Yeah, you become a matchmaker of sorts. So that kind of coordination is something also that can go on. Companies like Qualcomm, Comcast, others, what they do is they have at least once a year a meeting, right? It's usually an internal conference. Maybe they invite some outside speakers or so. But the idea is to bring together everybody in the company who has an active interest in open source. Right? So that what are the newest products? What are we using? What are our new policies? Here you guys should talk to each other. All those kinds of things go on. And the last piece that the Open Source Project Office does, it's very important. I have a slide, it's hard to read, but they work with the rest of the world. So if I want to go and talk to my friends at Salesforce about how they're using open source, and they're a big user of open source, as you may have heard yesterday morning. Yeah, I know the guy who runs their open source project office. I've known him since long before he came to Salesforce. So if I have a question, he's the guy, he's the person. Right? That's a good contact starting point. And if you're, of course, the person who's leading an open source project or responsible for marketing that open source project, that's the person you want to connect to because that person has contacts and influence inside the company. The last thing that the open source project has to do is to think about how you work with the rest of the community. You work with foundations. Well, some of those foundations count on contributions. So if I'm making a lot of use of some Apache project, the right thing for me to do is to become a sponsor and to donate money to help them get their work done because I'm taking advantage of it. I may be contributing back a little bit, but part of it is being a good citizen in the open source world and making those kinds of contributions. And we heard the Salesforce and the Comcast talk in particular were companies, our companies, they were very proud of what they've done, the road they've taken in using open source software and bringing it in, how they manage it. And it's taken them a while. It's been a road for all of them. And you can see that there are a lot of things that they have to do. So it turns out that I had a case study, and it is Comcast. I did this months ago. But what I want to show you about this, and it complements what the speaker said earlier, which is they first started using open source software way back in 2006, at the dark ages of open source. And Comcast, as you may or may not know, is a cable television provider and an internet service provider. And in fact, my family is their customer, and we send them much more money every month than we should. But that's a separate discussion. There's some notes here, but the thing that I want to point out is that they didn't establish their open source project office until 2017. It went more than 10 years of using open source before they got it all together. And the woman who runs that office is Nitya Ruff, and and she has a really smart team of people scattered around the company who fulfill all these different functions of the open source project office. Now they're involved with several foundations. Nitya is on the board of directors of the Linux Foundation. You can go to their GitHub page and you'll see the projects that they make available to the world to use or contribute to. So if you ask them, why'd they do this? Why did they get involved in open source? You'll see that these reasons are very common reasons. You'll hear these reasons from lots of other companies when you talk about open source project offices. Basically, they wanted to stop reinventing the wheel, build stuff faster, so they could bring in open source software for this low-level infrastructure stuff and concentrate on the things that were going to be innovative for their company. They also spend a lot of time talking about how valuable the use of open source is for attracting people. Their main office is near the city of Philadelphia in the eastern part of the United States, which is not, let's be nice, it's not a high-tech area, okay? So, but it's probably, they probably have the best open source job for 50 kilometers in any direction, because this is, you know, where they've focused. And the other thing they have discovered is that they can build a collaborative culture. Right? That the idea that people are working on open source projects, the collaborative culture is not just limited to the people who work for Comcast, but for the community of people around. So just as we had a speaker from Comcast here, if you go to the Southern California Linux Expo, which is a conference about the same size as this one every year, they're there, right? You know, they get up and they talk and they distribute and they recruit and do all these kinds of things. So, you know, if you ask them, has it been a success? The answer absolutely is yes. So, to finish up, for those of you who just arrived, we're doing okay on time. We're only a few minutes over noon. So it's a slow process for enterprises to adopt open source software. Now, I don't mean the startup with 6 people, because they don't ever think about proprietary software. If you work in a startup, they don't pay for software. I mean, Facebook doesn't pay for software. The culture is one of free and open source software. What I'm talking about are the insurance companies that have been around 100 years, or the telecom companies, or manufacturing companies of different types. That's where you're going to see the process go on, but where it will go on slowly. Because, you know, when you're going to make a significant change like this, you need a lot of levels of approval. You need a lot of people to buy in. People want to see small-sized demonstrations. They want proof of concept. They want to know that it was successful before they're willing to invest more. And so this takes some time, just as we showed on that timeline that represented Comcast's. Because you need to be successful with open source, you need to get commitments at all levels. Because otherwise somebody will pop up and say, we can't do this. Okay, so we'd like that not to happen. The other thing is that when you do open source, you become automatically part of a community. You're working on certain open source projects. Those projects are time critical, but you're going to give back. So there's very definitely this notion of a community around them. So let me take just a moment to give you a word from my sponsors. One is on this software management program at Carnegie Mellon. We're always looking for students. You can do it remotely in a year, in 2 years, or you can come to Silicon Valley and do it in a year.